The armed gunmen burst through the school's main entrance at 2:17 p.m., automatic weapons raised and tactical gear gleaming under the fluorescent lights. 300 students and staff scattered in pure terror, screaming and running for any exit they could find. But the homeless janitor named David stopped. He set down his mop, and 20 years of training that everyone had forgotten suddenly took control. Nobody knew that this homeless man was about to become the only thing standing between innocent children and certain death. Welcome to Untold Legends. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden heroism and deadly precision, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. If you believe that real warriors sometimes hide in the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button and help us share these powerful tales of courage that deserve to be remembered. But let's rewind to understand how a homeless man pushing a mop cart became the most dangerous person in that building when it mattered most. Because David Thompson's story begins not with tragedy, but with 15 years of daily humiliation that nearly broke his spirit. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., David unlocked the side entrance of Jefferson High School with a key that felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. His clothes were donated, his shoes held together with duct tape, and his gray beard needed trimming. The security guards barely acknowledged him as he wheeled his cart through empty hallways, beginning another day of invisibility. The students were the worst part, not because they were cruel by nature, but because their casual dismissal of his humanity cut deeper than any enemy fire he'd faced in 3 war zones. "You homeless guys here," whispered Ashley, a senior who'd never known a day of real hardship. Her friends giggled as David quietly cleaned around their lockers, pretending he couldn't hear their comments about his smell, his appearance, his obvious failure in life. "Why doesn't he just get a real job?" asked Tyler, a football player whose biggest worry was his college scholarship. "I mean, anybody can work. He's just lazy." David kept his eyes down, focusing on the simple rhythm of mopping that had become his meditation. Push, pull, rinse, repeat. It was easier than remembering who he used to be before everything fell apart. The teachers weren't much better. They spoke about him in third person even when he was in the room, discussing his situation with the kind of condescending pity that made David want to disappear entirely. "Poor man," said Mrs. Henderson to another teacher as David emptied trash cans nearby. "I heard he sleeps in the park. Someone should call social services." What none of them knew was that David Thompson had once been Staff Sergeant David "Reaper" Thompson, Navy SEAL Team 6. For 20 years, he had been part of the most elite fighting force on the planet, conducting operations in places that didn't exist on official maps, eliminating threats that posed dangers to national security. His military record was so classified that even mentioning some of his missions would be considered treason. David had led teams through hostile territory in Afghanistan, conducted precision strikes in Iraq, and participated in counterterrorism operations that saved thousands of American lives. But all that ended on a night in Syria, when everything went wrong. The details of that mission were buried so deep in classified files that David himself wasn't allowed to discuss them, even with therapists. What he could remember were fragments: the sound of his teammates' scream, the explosion that took 3 good men, the political decision that left his unit exposed and abandoned. David had survived, but the man who came home wasn't the same man who had left. The nightmares started first, then the drinking, then the inevitable spiral that cost him his marriage, his civilian job, and eventually his home. For 15 years, David had been invisible, not because he chose to be, but because that's how society treats its broken warriors. The man who had once been trusted with America's most dangerous secrets was now trusted with nothing more than a mop and bucket. But trauma doesn't erase training. Alcoholism doesn't delete muscle memory. And homelessness doesn't remove the instincts that had kept David alive through hundreds of combat operations. Those instincts were about to save 300 innocent lives. It was a Tuesday afternoon when 17-year-old Marcus Rodriguez stayed after school for tutoring. Marcus was different from the other students, not because he was kinder, but because he was observant. His father was a Marine Corps veteran, and Marcus had grown up around military culture. That's why he noticed details about David that others missed. The way the homeless janitor constantly scanned exits and entry points, how his eyes tracked movement with tactical precision. The fact that despite his disheveled appearance, David maintained perfect situational awareness at all times. Most telling was the faded tattoo on David's forearm, partially visible when he rolled up his sleeves to clean. Marcus had seen similar markings on his father's military friends, the kind of ink that told stories about brotherhood, sacrifice, and classified operations. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said quietly one afternoon as David cleaned the tutoring room, "were you military?" David's hands stopped moving for just a moment. In that brief pause, Marcus saw something flicker behind the homeless man's tired eyes. Recognition, caution, and maybe a hint of the warrior he used to be. "Long time ago," David said simply, returning to his work. Marcus wanted to ask more questions, but something in David's tone suggested that conversation was over. The boy filed the information away, not knowing that in 3 days, that knowledge would prove crucial. The attack began at exactly 2:17 p.m. on Friday afternoon. 3 men in tactical gear entered through the main entrance, weapons drawn and faces covered. They moved with military precision. Too much precision for random criminals. This was planned, coordinated, and designed for maximum casualties. The first shots shattered the glass doors and sent students screaming through hallways. Within seconds, the school's emergency protocols activated. Lockdown alarms blared. Teachers barricaded doors, and 300 terrified people tried to hide from killers who seemed to know exactly where they were going. David was mopping the second-floor hallway when he heard the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire. Not firecrackers, not construction noise, but the unmistakable rhythm of combat that had been burned into his memory through 2 decades of warfare. Every instinct told him to run. The homeless part of his brain, the broken part that had learned to avoid conflict and confrontation, screamed at him to hide like everyone else. But then he heard something that changed everything. Children crying. Somewhere in the chaos below, kids were trapped and dying. The same kids who mocked him, ignored him, treated him like garbage. But they were still just children. And children don't deserve to die because adults have forgotten how to protect them. David set down his mop with deliberate precision. For the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to remember who he really was. Staff Sergeant David Thompson, United States Navy SEAL. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. David's posture straightened, his eyes sharpened, and every movement became calculated for maximum efficiency. The broken homeless man disappeared, replaced by a weapon that had been forged in the crucible of America's most elite military training. David moved through the school like a ghost, using maintenance corridors and service routes that he'd memorized during months of invisible labor. He could hear the attackers' tactical communications, recognize their movement patterns, and predict their next targets. They were heading for the cafeteria, where over 200 students and staff were trapped in lockdown. What the attackers didn't know was that they were being hunted by someone whose job description for 20 years had been hunting people exactly like them. David reached the cafeteria's service entrance just as the gunmen prepared to breach the main doors. Through a small window, he could see terrified students huddled under tables, teachers trying desperately to keep children quiet and calm. He also saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the attackers was carrying enough explosives to level half the building. This wasn't just a shooting. It was a planned massacre designed to kill as many people as possible. David had two choices. He could maintain his cover, stay hidden, and hope that police response would be fast enough to prevent the worst-case scenario. Or he could reveal 15 years of carefully constructed invisibility and become the target himself. The decision took exactly 1 second. David opened the service door and stepped into the cafeteria behind the three attackers. His voice, when he spoke, carried the calm authority of someone who had commanded men in life-and-death situations. "Drop your weapons, now!" The three men spun around, expecting to see a police officer or security guard. Instead, they found themselves facing a homeless janitor in stained clothes, holding nothing but a cell phone. They laughed. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was underestimating what 20 years of Navy SEAL training could accomplish, even in a man whose society had written off as worthless. David moved with a speed and precision that defied his age and appearance. The first attacker's weapon was in David's hands before the man even realized he'd lost it. The second man managed to raise his rifle before David's elbow connected with his temple, dropping him unconscious to the floor. The third attacker, the one carrying explosives, tried to activate his detonator. David's combat knife, a blade he'd carried for 2 decades and hidden in his maintenance cart, found its mark with surgical precision. The entire engagement lasted 18 seconds. When the police tactical teams finally breached the cafeteria doors 3 minutes later, they found David sitting calmly beside 3 neutralized threats, weapons secured and explosives safely disarmed. 200 students and staff members stared in absolute shock at the homeless janitor who had just saved their lives with skills that seemed impossible for someone in his position. Marcus Rodriguez was the first to speak. His voice cracked with emotion as he looked at the man he'd suspected was more than he appeared. "You're not just former military, are you?" David looked at the boy who had been the only person to show him basic human respect. For a moment, his carefully maintained cover wavered. "Navy SEAL," he said quietly. "Team 6, 20 years." The words hit the room like a physical force. Teachers gasped. Students who had mocked him for months stared with new understanding. The police officers immediately shifted their posture, recognizing they were in the presence of someone from America's most elite military unit. But the most profound change was in David himself. For the first time in 15 years, he stood straight. The shame that had bent his shoulders was replaced by the quiet dignity of a man who had remembered his worth. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of what David had prevented. The 3 attackers were part of a domestic terrorism cell planning to target multiple schools across the state. Their explosives were powerful enough to collapse the entire cafeteria, potentially killing everyone inside. The tactical analysis of David's intervention left law enforcement professionals speechless. He had neutralized 3 heavily armed, well-trained terrorists using nothing but hand-to-hand combat skills and a maintenance knife. Most importantly, he had done it while ensuring 0 civilian casualties, a level of precision that spoke to training most people couldn't imagine. The media attention that followed was overwhelming. National news outlets wanted interviews. Military magazines published analyses of the tactical engagement. Social media exploded with videos, and commentary about the homeless hero who had saved an entire school. But David, true to his SEAL training, avoided the spotlight. He gave one brief statement to local media. "I did what anyone would have done to protect children." What he didn't say was that his action had accomplished something beyond saving lives. It had restored his identity. Within days, David's story reached the right people in the right places. Former SEAL teammates who had lost touch with him years ago began reaching out. Veterans organizations offered support services. A private security firm, recognizing his unique skills and experience, offered him a position that would use his talents appropriately. Most importantly, the school board of Jefferson High School offered David a new position, Director of Security and Emergency Preparedness. Not because they felt guilty about how he'd been treated, but because they recognized that his skills and experience made him uniquely qualified to protect their students. David accepted the position, but he made one request. He wanted to continue his morning cleaning routine, at least occasionally. Not because he enjoyed the work, but because those quiet hours had taught him something valuable about humility and service. On his first day as Director of Security, David walked through the same hallways he'd been mopping for months. But this time, students greeted him with respect. Teachers asked for his advice. Staff members who had previously ignored him now sought his expertise on safety protocols. The change was most noticeable in Marcus Rodriguez, the student who had first suspected David's background. Marcus had decided to pursue a military career, inspired by meeting a real hero who had never stopped serving his country, even when his country had forgotten about him. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said one afternoon, "what made you stay? Why didn't you just run when the shooting started?" David considered the question carefully. "Because leaving wasn't an option, not when children needed protection." "But you could have been killed. You were outnumbered and outgunned." David smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had ever seen from him. "Son, I was never outgunned. I was trained by the best military in the world to handle exactly these kinds of situations. The only difference was that, for 15 years, I forgot who I was." The conversation continued, but Marcus understood the deeper message. Real heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry badges. Sometimes they're invisible until the moment when their country needs them most. 6 months later, David received a letter that made him sit down hard in his office chair. It was from the Department of Defense, signed by the Secretary of the Navy. The letter formally acknowledged his classified service record and offered him a consulting position with Navy Special Warfare Command, helping to train the next generation of SEAL operators. But the most meaningful part wasn't the job offer. It was the final paragraph, which read, "Your actions at Jefferson High School demonstrate that the warrior spirit that makes someone a Navy SEAL never truly retires. Thank you for your continued service to America's children and for reminding us that heroes come in many forms." David folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer next to a photograph from his new life. The Jefferson High School security team, with David in the center, surrounded by staff members who had learned to see past appearances to recognize real strength. The homeless janitor was gone in forever. In his place stood a man who had reclaimed his identity not through recognition or praise, but through the simple act of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. David Thompson had learned that true warriors are defined not by their rank or their weapons, but by their willingness to act when others cannot. He had discovered that real strength isn't measured by what you've accomplished, but by what you're willing to sacrifice for people who may never understand the depth of your service. And most importantly, he had proven that society's most invisible members are sometimes its most valuable protectors, waiting quietly in the shadows until the moment when ordinary people need extraordinary intervention. Now I ask you, have you ever dismissed someone based on their appearance, only to discover they were far more than they seemed? Have you ever met someone whose quiet strength revealed itself only in moments of crisis? Share your story in the comments, because at Untold Legends, we believe that real heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they mop floors and sleep in parks, carrying skills and experiences that could save your life if you just took the time to see them as human beings. If this story inspired you to look twice at the people society overlooks, hit that like button to help us reach others who need to remember that extraordinary people often hide in the most ordinary circumstances. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell for more stories about warriors who never stopped serving, even when their service went unrecognized. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of sacrifice, redemption, and the courage that emerges when someone remembers who they really are. Thank you for watching. And remember, the most dangerous person in the room might be the one nobody notices, quietly protecting everyone around them without asking for recognition or praise.